The news didn't break with flashing headlines or celebrity fanfare. There was no red carpet, no dramatic announcement, no carefully staged photos meant to dominate social media. Instead, it slipped out quietly, almost accidentally. A short business filing, a simple registration, a new company name most people scrolled past without a second thought. Steven Seagal had launched a company. At first, no one paid attention. And maybe that was the point. In an industry addicted to noise, this move felt strangely silent. No interviews, no hype videos, no promises about changing the world, just paperwork, dates, and signatures. To outsiders, it looked unimpressive, almost boring. But boredom didn't last long. Within days, people started noticing who was not reacting. Major outlets stayed quiet. Industry insiders didn't comment. Analysts shrugged it off in private group chats. And then came the assumptions. They said it was a vanity project. Another celebrity experiment that would fade as quickly as it appeared. A name trying to open doors that experience never could. Online forums filled in the blanks with laughter instead of facts. He'll lose interest. It's just branding. This won't last 6 months. What they didn't realize was that Steven wasn't watching the headlines. He was watching people. While others debated whether he belonged in that space, he was already inside it, walking floors, listening to conversations, learning how decisions were really made when cameras weren't around. He didn't announce meetings. He didn't dominate rooms. He asked questions that made people pause before answering. To those who met him early, something felt different. There was no rush, no desperation to prove anything, no anger at being underestimated, just patience. The company itself reflected that same energy, no flashy slogans, no oversized claims. Everything was structured, deliberate, and oddly disciplined. Behind the scenes, a small team began forming, quiet professionals who didn't care about celebrity, but cared deeply about results. People with long resumes and even longer memories. People who had seen hype come and go and knew the difference between noise and intent. And still, the world laughed. Competitors dismissed it as irrelevant. Investors looked elsewhere. Critics called it predictable. But beneath the surface, something was already moving. Because Steven didn't launch this company to impress anyone. He launched it to test something, not the market, but the mindset of everyone watching. Who judges too quickly? Who listens too little? Who confuses silence for weakness? This wasn't the beginning of a business story. It was the beginning of a lesson. And most people didn't even realize they were already part of it. Do you think this company will fail or shock everyone? Comment file or sharper ice. As the company began taking its first real steps, the silence around it slowly changed shape. It didn't disappear, it hardened. Behind glass conference rooms and closed office doors, the same question kept surfacing, not spoken loudly, but repeated often enough to become consensus. What is he doing here? Executives who had spent decades climbing corporate ladders skimmed the company profile and smirked. To them, this wasn't a serious operation. It was a curiosity, a footnote, something to joke about over coffee before returning to real business. They didn't see strategy. They saw a name. Emails sent by Steven's team were answered late, if at all. Meeting requests were redirected, delayed, or quietly declined. One potential partner canceled a call without explanation, then announced a similar initiative weeks later, as if nothing had happened. The message was clear. You may be known somewhere else, but not here. Inside the industry, respect wasn't given. It was guarded, rationed, protected by titles and resumes, and Steven had walked in without either of those shields. No corporate pedigree, no familiar boardroom allies, just a calm presence that didn't fit their expectations, and that made people uncomfortable. At one early networking event, conversation stopped mid-sentence when he approached. Smiles were polite but thin, introductions were rushed. Some spoke around him instead of to him, as if proximity alone might legitimize something they refused to acknowledge. Someone joked, loud enough to be heard. Wiss fame finally got bored. Laughter followed. Not everyone joined in, but no one stopped it either. Steven didn't react. He stood there, listened, nodded once, and moved on. That reaction or lack of one confused people more than anger ever could. They expected defensiveness, ego, a sharp reply. Instead, they got composure. And in rooms built on dominance, composure without explanation felt threatening. Meanwhile, the company faced practical obstacles. Suppliers demanded stricter terms. Service providers inflated prices. Background checks took longer than usual. Every delay carried the same unspoken assumption. Let's see how serious this really is. Within the company walls, pressure mounted. A few early hires wondered if they had made a mistake. They believed in the vision, but belief doesn't pay in voices. Late nights turned into quiet doubts, not spoken aloud but felt. Still, Steven remained consistent. He arrived early, left late, sat in on departments no one expected him to care about. He listened to junior staff the same way he listened to senior advisors. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss concerns. When someone spoke, they felt heard, even if no immediate solution followed. That steadiness began to ripple outward. Small things started changing. A vendor who had been difficult suddenly became cooperative. A canceled meeting quietly reappeared on the calendar. A skeptical consultant stayed longer than planned, not because of pressure, but because of curiosity. People wanted to understand why someone so underestimated refused to act like it. Outside, however, the narrative stayed ugly. Trade blogs labeled the company uncertain. Commentators questioned leadership, fit. Critics waited for a stumble they could amplify. And then came the moment that exposed everything. During a multi-company strategy session, Steven's team presented a proposal clear, grounded, data-driven. It wasn't flashy. It was practical, sustainable, profitable. The room listened. Then a senior figure leaned back, folded his arms, and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Interesting, but we're looking for something more credible." The implication hung in the air. Not better, not smarter, just not him. A few people shifted in their seats. Others avoided eye contact. No one defended the proposal. Silence did the damage for them. Steven thanked them for their time. As they walked out, someone whispered, "This is why celebrities shouldn't play business." Steven heard it. And still, he said nothing. Because what no one in that room understood was simple. He wasn't there to win approval. He was there to observe patterns. Who dismissed ideas without reading them? Who followed laughter instead of logic? Who mistook confidence for noise and silence for weakness? This phase wasn't a setback, it was reconnaissance. And the people underestimating him were unknowingly teaching him exactly how to win later. The pressure wasn't breaking the company, it was shaping it. By the time the third month arrived, the pressure was no longer subtle. It sat in the room during meetings. It followed conversations down hallways. It showed up in pauses that lasted a second too long. This was the phase where most new companies cracked. The early curiosity had faded. The quiet disrespect had solidified. Now came the waiting, the industry's favorite tactic. Let them burn cash, let morale slip, let impatience do the work. Inside the company, numbers were watched closely. Timelines tightened. Every decision carried more weight than before. One wrong move wouldn't just slow progress, it would confirm every doubt whispered from the outside. Some employees felt it deeply. They had left stable positions to be here. They believed in the vision, but belief was now being tested by reality. Family members asked uncomfortable questions. Friends sent articles that sounded polite but felt loaded. "So how's that thing going?" Steven noticed the shift. Not because people complained, but because they didn't. He saw it in the way conversations shortened, in the way optimism became quieter, in how people started bringing problems wrapped in solutions, afraid that doubt might sound like weakness. That's when he did something unexpected. He called a meeting, not with executives but with the entire team. No podium, no slides, no speech. He listened. One by one, people spoke, carefully at first, then more honestly. Concerns about cash flow, about perception, about whether the industry would ever take them seriously. Steven didn't interrupt. When the room finally went quiet, he didn't reassure them with promises. He didn't motivate them with slogans. He simply said, "This part was always coming." That sentence landed heavier than any pep talk. He explained that resistance wasn't a sign of failure. It was proof they were being taken seriously enough to be tested. That if no one felt threatened, no one would bother pushing back. Pressure, he said, wasn't something to escape. It was something to study. From that moment on, the company shifted gears. Instead of chasing validation, they doubled down on execution. Instead of explaining themselves, they focused on delivering results so clean they couldn't be ignored. Steven became even quieter. He stopped attending certain meetings, delegated more authority, trusted the structure they had built. To outsiders, it looked like disengagement. Inside, it felt like trust. Meanwhile, competitors began circling closer, not openly, never openly, but subtly, hiring away talent, mimicking ideas, releasing announcements that sounded suspiciously familiar. The message was clear: we're watching you now. And still, the doors didn't open. A major partnership stalled at the final stage without explanation. Another deal died after weeks of positive feedback. The company's name appeared in discussions, but rarely with enthusiasm. Yet something strange was happening beneath all of that. Small wins began stacking up. Processes improved, costs dropped. Clients who actually worked with the company stayed longer than expected. Quiet loyalty replaced loud hype. One advisor pulled Steven aside one evening and asked the question everyone else avoided. "Why aren't you pushing back harder?" Steven smiled, not arrogantly, not defensively, but with certainty. "Because they're rushing," he said, "and we're not." That patience started to unsettle people. In a culture obsessed with speed, restraint felt rebellious. While others raced to be first, Steven focused on being right. While critics waited for a collapse, the foundation grew stronger, layer by layer. The tension peaked during a closed-door industry gathering. The company was mentioned briefly, dismissively, until someone else interrupted. "Actually," they said, "we've been using their system for weeks." The room paused. That wasn't part of the script. Questions followed. Quiet ones, curious ones. For the first time, doubt flickered. Not about the company, but about the assumptions everyone had agreed to without evidence. Steven said nothing. He didn't need to. Because the pressure that was supposed to crush them was doing the opposite. It was filtering out noise, exposing bias, revealing who paid attention and who followed the crowd. This wasn't survival mode anymore. This was control. And the people who had underestimated him were beginning to feel something new creeping in beneath their confidence. Uncertainty. "Do you think pressure creates diamonds or destroys them?" typed Ariman or Burcase. While the outside world remained focused on speculation, Steven shifted his attention inward. This was the phase most people never noticed. The part of the story that didn't make headlines because it didn't look dramatic enough to matter. But it mattered more than anything. Instead of reacting to pressure, Steven began reorganizing the company from the inside out. Not with sudden shakeups or loud announcements, but with small, precise adjustments that only insiders could feel at first. Roles were clarified, processes were tightened, decision-making lines became cleaner. Meetings became shorter, but more effective. Reports became simpler but more honest. Every change had a reason, and every reason pointed back to one idea: sustainability. Steven didn't want growth that depended on momentum alone. He wanted a structure that could survive doubt, delay, and distraction, something that wouldn't collapse the moment attention drifted elsewhere. He brought in people no one expected. Not celebrities, not headline names. Instead, quiet specialists, operators, strategists who had spent years fixing broken systems for companies that never credited them publicly. People who didn't chase recognition because they had already learned how fragile it was. When asked why he chose them, Steven answered simply, "They know how to work without applause." That mindset changed the culture. Suddenly, performance mattered more than perception. Consistency mattered more than speed. Preparation mattered more than luck. While competitors announced expansions, Steven focused on integration. While others chased trends, he asked harder questions about long-term relevance. Every move was measured not by how impressive it looked today, but by how reliable it would be tomorrow. And then came the decision no one saw coming. Steven stepped back, not from leadership but from visibility. He stopped being the face of every conversation. He let others represent the company publicly. He gave credit freely and took responsibility quietly. To the outside world, it looked like he was fading into the background. That assumption was a mistake. Behind the scenes, Steven was watching everything, tracking where friction appeared, identifying which systems held under stress and which ones cracked. He treated the company like a living organism, strengthening weak points before they became visible problems. Inside the team, confidence slowly returned. Not the loud kind, the steady kind. People stopped asking if the company would survive and started asking how far it could go. Doubt didn't vanish, but it lost its power. It became something to manage, not something to fear. Even suppliers noticed the difference. Negotiations became smoother. Timelines stabilized, real trust began forming. No one announced it, but the tone had shifted. Still, the industry remained unaware. They were too busy watching the wrong signals. They looked for press releases, dramatic partnerships, viral moments. When none came, they assumed nothing was happening. That's when Steven made his quietest move yet. He changed the company's focus, not radically, subtly. Instead of competing head-on where giants already dominated, he redirected resources toward an overlooked segment, one that others considered too small, too slow, too unglamorous. But Steven saw something different. He saw loyalty where others saw inconvenience, stability where others saw boredom, opportunity where others saw limits. The shift didn't make noise. It didn't trend. Early feedback was strong. Retention improved. Word of mouth spread not online but person to person. The kind that doesn't spike overnight but doesn't disappear either. This wasn't a gamble. It was positioning. By the time competitors noticed movement, the foundation was already locked in. They couldn't replicate it quickly because they hadn't prepared for patience. Their systems were built for speed, not endurance. Steven had prepared for both, and still, he said very little. No victory laps, no I told you so, no public validation. Because the goal was never to prove anyone wrong. It was to make being wrong irrelevant. This phase didn't feel exciting to outsiders, but to those inside the company, it felt unmistakable. Like standing on solid ground after months of uncertainty, something had shifted. The pressure was no longer external. It had transferred. And the people who once dismissed the company were about to realize they had been watching the surface, while everything important was happening underneath. The first signs of change didn't arrive with announcements or applause. They arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, like a shift in weather that only careful observers can feel before the clouds move. Phone calls that once went unanswered were returned. Emails that had stalled for weeks now came back within hours. Conversations that used to end politely were suddenly extended. No one admitted it openly, but the industry was paying attention now. It started with a single contract, not a massive one, not headline-worthy, just significant enough to matter. A respected mid-level firm committed after months of observation, citing one simple reason: reliability. The systems worked. The people delivered. The results matched the promises. That contract led to another, then another. Momentum began building not explosively but steadily. And in business, steady momentum is far more dangerous to competitors than sudden spikes. Spikes can be dismissed as luck. Consistency cannot. Inside the company, the atmosphere changed. Meetings felt lighter. Decisions felt clearer. People stopped bracing for failure and started planning for growth. The same employees who once whispered doubts now stayed late. Not out of fear, but focus. They weren't scrambling anymore. They were refining. Steven noticed this shift and did something deliberate. Nothing. He didn't celebrate prematurely. He didn't push faster. He let the process breathe. Because he knew something others didn't, this moment was fragile. Too much attention too soon could undo months of discipline. Growth needed to be absorbed, not chased. Outside, competitors grew uneasy. They began requesting data, asking questions, testing boundaries. Some tried to imitate the company's approach, but without understanding the reasoning behind it. They copied surface-level tactics, not the patience that made them work, and it showed. Meanwhile, industry conversations changed tone. The company's name surfaced more often, no longer as a joke, but as a curiosity. Panels mentioned it cautiously. Analysts included it as a developing presence. Not praise, but no longer dismissal either. Steven remained absent from those discussions. He let the work speak. The true turning point came during a multi-party evaluation process involving several major players. The company wasn't expected to stand out. It wasn't the biggest, it wasn't the loudest, but it was prepared. While others pitched vision, Steven's team presented outcomes. While competitors promised speed, they demonstrated stability. While others sold potential, they showed proof. The room noticed. One evaluator asked a question that changed everything. How long have you been operating like this? The answer surprised them. They had assumed the discipline was new, something adopted recently. Learning it had been there from the beginning shifted the entire perception. After that meeting, the doors opened faster. Introductions led to negotiations. Negotiations led to commitments. Commitments led to scale. Not reckless scale. Controlled scale. Steven approved growth only where systems could support it. He rejected opportunities that moved too fast. Some advisors warned he was being overly cautious. He disagreed. Fast growth is easy, he said. Sustained growth isn't. That philosophy protected the company. While others expanded too quickly and struggled to maintain quality, Steven's company absorbed pressure smoothly. Mistakes happened, but they were corrected without panic. Problems arose, but they were handled without drama. This consistency created something rare. Trust, not the marketing kind, the operational kind. Clients recommended the company without being asked. Partners stayed longer than contracts required. Employees began referring people they respected, something they would never do if they doubted leadership. Still, Steven avoided the spotlight. He declined interviews, passed on speaking opportunities, let others take credit publicly. To those who had doubted him, this restraint was confusing. They expected a victory lap, a shift in tone, some sign of ego. It never came. And that unsettled them more than arrogance ever could. Because it suggested something uncomfortable. This success wasn't personal. It was intentional. The turning point wasn't about recognition. It was about inevitability. The company had crossed an invisible line, from being questioned to being considered, from being watched to being measured, from being dismissed to being studied. And for the first time since launch, the people who laughed at the beginning weren't laughing anymore. They were calculating. Because they could finally see what Steven had been building all along. Not a moment, a position. And once a position is established, it's very hard to take away. By the time the announcement was scheduled, expectations were quietly rising, but still controlled. The industry had learned not to underestimate the company anymore, yet few believed the outcome would be anything more than solid, respectable, encouraging, safe. That assumption would be their last mistake. The announcement wasn't held on a massive stage. There were no dramatic countdowns, no celebrity appearances, no viral trailers teasing what was coming. Instead, it arrived as a straightforward briefing, clean slides, clear numbers, calm delivery. At first, the room reacted politely. Then the data kept coming. Revenue growth that wasn't fueled by hype, retention rates that exceeded industry norms, operational costs that were lower than competitors with twice the exposure. People leaned forward. This wasn't a spike. This wasn't luck. This wasn't borrowed momentum. It was structural. As the presentation continued, a quiet realization spread across the room, one no one wanted to say out loud just yet. They hadn't been watching a startup. They had been watching a system. The most unexpected moment didn't come from a graph or a projection. It came when someone asked the question everyone was thinking. How did you achieve this without aggressive expansion? There was a pause. Then Steven spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. We didn't grow fast, he said. We grew right. That was it. No long explanation, no defense, no celebration. But the room felt it. Because in an industry obsessed with shortcuts, someone had chosen discipline and won. As questions continued, the pattern became undeniable. Every metric pointed to long-term positioning. Every decision traced back to restraint, preparation, and patience. The company wasn't reacting to the market. It was anticipating it. Competitors exchanged looks. Some nodded slowly. Others stayed frozen, already calculating how far behind they might be. Then came the final slide. Not flashy, not emotional. Just a clear outline of the next phase, measured expansion, strategic partnerships, and one key initiative no one had anticipated. An initiative that quietly locked an advantage where others couldn't easily follow. That's when the room changed completely. Because they understood something crucial. This wasn't the peak. It was the floor. The meeting ended without applause. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because people were processing what they had just witnessed. Conversations spilled into hallways. Phoned messages were sent. Word spread fast. Not in headlines but in decisions. Calls that had once been delayed now came immediately. Offers arrived without being chased. Competitors shifted strategy overnight. And Steven, he didn't stay long. He thanked the team, shook a few hands, left quietly. No interviews, no statements, no victory tour. To outsiders, that restraint was baffling. Why not enjoy the moment? Why not claim the win? But to those who truly understood what had happened, the reason was obvious. This ending was never the goal. It was confirmation. Steven hadn't built the company to prove critics wrong. He hadn't built it to surprise anyone. He built it to last. And that realization, more than any number or announcement, was what truly shook the room. Because when success doesn't need attention, it becomes very hard to stop. Did this ending surprise you? Type respite if you saw it coming, or shiokade if you didn't. After the meetings ended and the numbers settled into reports, something quieter remained. Not excitement, not celebration, reflection. Because the real impact of what had happened wasn't found in growth charts or future projections. It lived in the shift that followed, in how people talked, how they judged, how they reconsidered what they thought they knew. Steven returned to the office the same way he always had. No entourage, no change in routine, no visible difference in attitude. To anyone expecting a transformation, that steadiness was surprising. But to those who had watched closely from the beginning, it made perfect sense. The company hadn't changed Steven. Steven had shaped the company to reflect what he already believed. Inside the team, conversations turned deeper. People spoke openly about the early days, the doubt, the pressure, the the moments they almost gave in to fear. They laughed about how quiet victories had felt heavier than loud praise. They realized they had learned something rare, how to operate without needing permission to be confident. The lesson wasn't about business. It was about restraint. Steven never chased validation. He didn't argue with critics. He didn't explain himself to people who had already decided who he was. He allowed time and consistency to do what noise never could. And that changed the way people around him thought about power. They had grown up believing power was loud. That authority demanded attention. That respect had to be enforced. But what they witnessed was different. Real power didn't interrupt. It didn't perform. It didn't rush. It prepared. Outside the company, the ripple spread slowly. Executives who once dismissed the project revisited their own decisions. Some wondered how often they had confused familiarity with credibility. Others recognized moments when they had laughed instead of listening, and what that had cost them. The story circulated quietly, almost like a warning. Not about Steven, about assumptions. People began to ask better questions, not just about companies but about individuals. Who they ignored, who they underestimated, who they had decided didn't belong before hearing them speak. Steven never addressed those conversations publicly. He didn't need to, because the lesson didn't require a spokesperson. It required awareness. In private discussions, someone once asked him what he considered the company's greatest success. They expected a number, a contract, a milestone. Steven paused before answering. That we didn't become what they expected, he said. What they expected was defensiveness, ego, reaction. What they got was discipline. The company's journey proved something simple but uncomfortable. Most doors don't stay closed because of lack of talent. They stay closed because of impatience. Because people demand recognition before earning leverage. Because they confuse being seen with being solid. Steven had waited. And in waiting, he had built something stronger than approval. The final takeaway wasn't about winning. It was about choosing the right game. Steven never competed for attention. He competed for position. While others raced for headlines, he invested in structure. While critics spoke, he listened. While doubts grew louder, he grew quieter. And that quiet changed everything. For those watching from the outside, the ending felt unexpected. But for Steven, it was inevitable. The outcome wasn't a surprise. It was the natural result of refusing to play by rules designed to reward noise over substance. The story doesn't end with applause. It ends with clarity. That you don't need permission to build something meaningful. That silence isn't weakness, it's control. That patience, when paired with discipline, outlasts every shortcut. Steven didn't prove anyone wrong. He made their doubts irrelevant. And that may be the most powerful ending of all. Those who judge quickly see little. Those who build quietly change everything.